before we get started on today's topic of strategic leadership, I thought I would just very briefly introduce myself. My name is Dan Rust. I am InfoPro Learning's Vice President of Global Leadership and Organizational Development. I have spent the last 30 years in a variety of organizational leadership roles. And the topic of strategic leadership is an interesting one because depending upon who you're talking to, the definition of what is strategic leadership, it evolves, it shifts, it's different. To some degree, it's impacted up by whether you are in a military organization or government or nonprofit or corporate. So, strategic thinking in a military context, of course, is very different than strategic thinking in a nonprofit context, and of course, that's different than in a corporate business development context. For today's purpose, we're going to stay, for the most part, in the corporate context of strategic leadership and what that actually means. But even within the corporate context, I've had these conversations with leaders over the decades, and I've had leaders come to me to say, so how do you define strategic leadership versus tactical? And of course, there's the easy definition, which is, well, tactical is small picture execution, strategic is big picture vision, etc. Which it answers the question, but I don't know that it's necessarily potentially useful. Where I usually start, if we're really going to dive into the conversation about, all right, what is strategic leadership? I generally start with this question. Well, let's just ask ourselves first, what is leadership? And I will ask people to share with me, what do you feel is the essence of leadership? What do you feel are the elements of leadership? What is leadership? And of course, lots and lots and lots of different answers, lots of characteristics of great leaders, lots of indications or responsibilities or accountabilities of leaders. But if you really ask yourself to boil that down, what is the essence of leadership? If you could boil it down to one sentence, one phrase, one item, if you had to make it the one thing, what is the one thing of leadership? And now, having had this conversation numerous times, most often we do end up boiling it down to one particular thing, and that thing is that leaders drive change. If there isn't a need for change, there probably isn't a need for leadership. If the team is headed off in the right direction and is operating effectively and operating properly, and we feel confident that they will continue to operate properly in the current state, there's probably not much of a role for a leader because everything is good the way it is. Now, if we have a concern that without leadership the team may drift, well, fine, then there is a role for a leader to keep the team from drifting off course. But again, that leader is driving change, and the change they're driving is change to keep the team on course. So if there isn't a need for change, even if the change is nudging to keep things on course, there probably isn't a role for a leader. So you may agree or not with the essence of that, but it works for me, and I'm the one talking, so I will share my point of view. Is this is the core, the essence of leadership, which then it does inform that question. If you ask yourself, well, what is then strategic leadership? Is strategic leadership just strategic planning? Is it developing and executing on a strategy? Of course it is that, but is it only that? Well, what we're going to go through today is certainly it's reflected by my point of view. My point of view does come from over 30 years of experience in the corporate world, helping organizations align their people, align their talents, align their strategy, align their course correction to a particular strategy, helping them develop a particular strategy. So my point of view regarding strategic leadership, I would call it a fairly expansive model. And where I believe strategic thinking impacts an organization starts with organizational culture, continues on with the people decisions within that organizational culture. It does include strategy development. It does include planning and execution, but it also includes change acceleration. And how do you strategically experiment as an organization? How do you decide how you're going to stretch as an organization and continue to evolve so that evolution and change is embedded into your DNA? I believe that's part of an organizational strategy. And when mistakes occur, when things don't work out the way they were expected, when there are failures, or when the market changes and there needs to be course correction for any of those reasons, because of a failure, because of a market change, whatever the reason, course correction itself has a strategic element, and how you correct course can be strategic or not. And then finally, how you respond to a crisis can be strategic or not. So that whole range of topics, from organizational culture all the way to crisis response, I view that entire end-to-end focus as being part of strategic leadership, and that's what we're going to talk through today. Now, with that said, I was going through my notes last night, and I started kind of sketching out what we would focus on, what I would help us talk through, and there's a lot. So I want to be transparent. We may very well go beyond the hour time limit. And some of you, perhaps most of you, will have to just click off at the end of the hour because you have other things to go on to, and I don't take that personally. I know you've got to do that. I would rather, though, give you the full end-to-end content related to strategic leadership. And so what we'll do is we'll provide this recording available to everyone after the webinar is complete. We'll follow up within 24 hours with the recording. So if you missed the last 20 or 30 minutes, then you'll be able to get that when you get the recording itself. So let's start, though, with one core element that I've observed over the years that makes strategic leaders different than other really good but less strategic leaders. I guess I'll describe it that way. We know that to be an effective leader in today's world, you have to be a critical thinker, you have to be a systems thinker, you have to be a strategic thinker. And many leaders tend to be stronger at one of those than the others, but they do have capabilities in all three of those areas. And critical and systems and strategic thinking are three very distinct ways of thinking. A critical thinker tends to be the person who is willing to think about their thinking, think about their process, question their thinking, and they will ask themselves not just what do we know, but how do we know it, and how do we know that it's accurate? So that critical thinking of constantly checking in and checking your thought process is an important part of a leader's thinking approach. Systems thinking, being able to connect all of the dots and then understand if we make one change here is the butterfly effect. Here is how that one change will affect other elements of the system. Being able to view your business as an end-to-end system and understand if I turn this cog, it affects these other cogs. That systems thinking is important. And then, of course, strategic thinking, being able to step back and think not just about the small picture tactical elements, but the bigger picture strategic elements of the business. The difference that I've noticed with high impact strategic leaders is they have a way of thinking that integrates all three of those into one thought process. And they are excellent in all three of those areas, and they operate consistently. So if they attack a problem or a project or a situation, whatever it might be, they bring to bear critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, really all at the same time. And that integration of those, it produces greater insights, it produces better judgment and ultimately drives better decisions from those leaders. So I guess what I could share with you in this program right now is simply to think about yourself in terms of your ability to be a critical thinker, a systems thinker, and a strategic thinker. Think about what those would mean if they were integrated together into one mode of thinking. And as you attack problems, as you attack situations, as you solve issues for your organization, try to consciously incorporate all three of those thinking modes. If it's not something that occurs to you naturally to do all three of those. So we're going to, as I said, we're going to go through kind of a gamut of topics related to strategic leadership. And we're going to start with culture. I do facilitate a fair number of strategic leadership sessions for organizations. And what I always find interesting is there's generally in most of the sessions an opening module on culture. And I have regularly had some leaders in those sessions start to get impatient because when they signed up to attend or when they were assigned to attend a strategic leadership program, they thought they were signing up for strategic planning. And when we start to talk about culture, there's a disconnect between what they were expecting and what we were focusing on. And I have had leaders, either when we have the first coffee break or maybe right in the middle of the session itself, ask why we're putting so much focus on organizational culture. I thought this was about strategy planning. Well, of course, organizational culture is a part of strategy. In fact, you're probably familiar with Peter Drucker's famous quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." We're probably all familiar with examples of organizations that had solid strategies that ultimately became overwhelmed by the actual culture of the organization. So if you're going to be a strategic leader, you do have to think about what is the culture that we need within our organization to actually implement whatever our strategy might be, whatever fancy thinking you go through, whatever well-defined strategy you build in terms of competitive response, a marketing response, how you're going to win in the workplace, or I'm sorry, how you're going to win in the marketplace. When you develop that strategy, it's important to be able to quickly back up with your systems thinking and to say, okay, let's look at our end-to-end system as an organization and let's start with culture. What culture do we have to have in order to be able to be effectively executing whatever that strategy is? And I like to talk to leaders about something that I call the leadership butterfly effect. I think leaders oftentimes don't really have a great awareness regarding how much impact they have on their organization just day to day in terms of their behaviors, their actions, their habits. And yet the people in an organization pay very close attention to what their leaders are doing and how they're doing it. And so if you are a leader who, for example, and I'll just give you a couple of very small examples, if you're a leader who has a habit of showing up late for meetings, and then generally I'll mention this because these two habits tend to go together in my experience. If you have a leader who tends to show up late for meetings, those same leaders tend to not necessarily feel bound by the constraints of the meeting time. So if you get to the end of the meeting time and the leader feels like he or she still has a need to continue talking or sharing or discussing, they're very comfortable, making a call on the fly or calling an audible and saying, hey, we'll continue this for the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And without really an appreciation for the fact that people have other meetings that they need to attend or other things that are on their schedule, or they won't even mention it. They won't even say it. They'll simply not pay attention to the ending of the meeting time. And so you have a leader who tends to show up late and their meetings tend to run long. If that is the characteristic of a leader, the organization notices that. They may never say it, it may not be presented to the leader, but it's noticed. And there does tend to be a butterfly effect of that specific characteristic, where is if the top leaders don't hold fast and firm to the pre-agreed upon timing constraints, well then for the rest of us, it's also an option as well. It's no longer a rule, it's no longer an expectation. It's treated more like if you're familiar with the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, when Jack Sparrow talks about the pirate code, and he says, or he or one of the characters says, yeah, the pirate code, it's more of a guide as opposed to an absolute set of rules. Well, again, leaders in their day-to-day interactions have butterfly effects throughout their organization that do impact the organizational culture. And so I would just suggest, as a strategic leader, you ask the question, what culture do we need in order to effect our strategy? And then what is my role as a leader day to day in driving that culture? If we need a culture of innovation where people are comfortable making, implementing experiments, trying new things, prototyping, and things not always being successful, if you're going to have a prototype culture, and if you've decided that's important, that we need people to try out new things, we need people to try experiments, we need people to stretch, well, what kind of leader do they need in order to have that kind of culture? Well, they need a leader who doesn't jump down on them if an experiment fails. They need a leader who actually supports failure, who supports learning from mistakes as well as learning from successes. And I'm just going down one specific track. That's not the only track. The important question is, what culture do we need, and what's my role as a leader in embedding that culture? And acknowledging that as leaders, we all live in bubbles. Whether you're a leader of a team of 3 people or an organization of 300,000 people, as you move up the hierarchy of the leadership ladder, so to speak, the bubble around you does expand and it gets thicker. And what it means is you aren't really living and working in the same world as most of the people around you. People are careful about what they deliver to you in terms of information. People are more careful about how they operate around you. And I know that most of us as leaders, we hate the idea of a bubble because we want to be able to see clearly what's happening and not happening in our organization. But sort of perversely, in order to see as clearly as possible, you have to acknowledge that the bubble exists. Now, there are a lot of things that you as a leader can do to minimize the bubble, but you can't eliminate it, because to the degree that you have control over other people's livelihoods, over other people's careers, over other people's futures, people are going to be careful. They are going to be conscious of what they share, what they don't share, how they share it. So these 2 concepts of the leadership bubble and the butterfly effect of a leader, as you're talking about organizational culture amongst your team, amongst your leaders, and as you're thinking about organizational culture from a strategic standpoint, I think it's important to, number 1, view culture as a part of your strategy. And then number 2, look at your own impact on culture in terms of your daily habits, your patterns, how you interact with people, how you impact people, how you as a leader operate, the butterfly effect of that, and how that impacts the people who report to you, and how the way they operate impacts the people that report to them. Ultimately, culture is strategy, and ultimately, leadership behaviors are culture. And so I hate to put just more burden on the shoulder of leaders, but a strategic leader understands that he or she is always on, they are always being observed, they are always under the microscope. And so as a strategic leader, you can't have a bad day. You can't assume that just because people aren't calling you on your behaviors that they aren't noticing. Of course they notice your behaviors. They notice your moods. They notice your communications. They notice who you talk to, who you don't talk to. They notice who you laugh with, who you don't laugh with. They notice whose ideas you respect and whose ideas you don't necessarily respect. There's a hyper focus on all of these things, and the more you move up the leadership ladder, the more that focus exists. So when we talk about organizational culture and strategic leadership, there's a lot there, and there's a lot for a leader to think about and to process and to understand that you are on all the time, and you and your leadership team are on all the time. And I have had leaders come to me and they will say, this doesn't really seem fair. First of all, I've got to do all these other things, and I'm responsible and accountable for all of these other things. And then in addition to all of that, what you're saying is I'm the culture, and that the butterfly effects of what I do, or how I and my cohort of leaders operate, we ultimately create the real culture of the organization, not the culture that's reflected in the mission statement or the value statement or some other leadership vision statement. What you create as a leader is the actual culture within the organization, and it is a burden. It is a responsibility of the leader. And if that's too much, or if you feel that that's not fair, I'm reminded of one of the Mission Impossible movies, where the character of Tom Cruise is complaining to the CIA director because for all the work that Tom Cruise's team has done for the country and for the world, the country is about to throw the team under the bus because it's expedient and they need that team to basically go away. And Tom is complaining because it feels like that's not very loyal, that's not very fair. And the CIA director's response is, but that's the job. And so it's not that I don't have empathy for leaders. Of course I do. Of course I have empathy. But in fact, if you're going to be a true strategic leader, you have to understand that how you operate day in and day out, not only at the macro level, but at the micro level, how you operate, it doesn't just impact the real culture in the organization. It is the real culture in the organization. And ultimately, there's a broad butterfly effect to that. So those are my thoughts related to organizational culture. The next phase of strategic thinking when it comes to strategic leadership, at least from my point of view, is in your people decisions. People, of course, are a reflection of culture, and your culture will attract certain kinds of people and it will repel other kinds of people. But if we think about our people decisions, not just from a tactical, hey, let's fill the job opening standpoint, but backing up from a strategic standpoint, you back up completely, you really need to occasionally, not all the time, not every month, not every quarter, perhaps not even every year, but occasionally step back and ask yourself about your overall organizational structure. What I see with strategic leaders is they do regularly, particularly if the market is evolving or if it's simply been 2 or 3 years since they've thought about this, they will step back and do an evaluation of their org structure. Are we structured in a way that serves our customers best, serves our market best right now? And they understand that org structures do evolve, or they should evolve over time in reaction to customers evolving, employees evolving, the market evolving. Organization structure should evolve. So I would just suggest that as a strategic leader, you occasionally, perhaps a cadence of every 2 years or every 3 years, ask yourself the question, are we structured in an optimal way? And how do we know? How do we decide how we should be structured? And then within that structure, I've got a couple of numbers to share with you, the number 53 and the number 36. 53, there was a recent survey of employees. It was about 8,000 employees that were surveyed. A broad range of companies were part of the survey, global companies, so broad demographics. Only 53% of the employees agreed or strongly agreed with a statement that said they had very clear work accountabilities and objectives, and that those clear objectives in terms of their work role were actually in writing, that they had very clear accountabilities in writing. And only 30%, 36% said that the clear accountabilities in writing were an accurate reflection of their real job. So those two numbers, where you have only about half of employees saying, I actually have a very detailed job description with clear accountabilities, and only about 30% of employees, or 33%, saying those accountabilities actually do reflect what I actually do. Those are tough numbers. Though that says to me, okay, we've got a real challenge when it comes to accountabilities within organizations. So it's not just enough to have the right org structure, but it's important that within that structure, every role has very clear accountabilities and interdependencies, and that those things are documented and that those are reviewed over time. Again, if you're going to be a strategic leader, you want to think through your organization from the macro view down to the micro view. It's not just the macro view. You connect all of the dots from big picture down to small picture, ensuring that every role's accountabilities and interdependencies with other roles is clarified. And only then do you start to think about how filling people into those seats. You have to have clear accountabilities in every specific role. And then once those roles have accountabilities that are clarified, then you can start deciding, do I have the right people in the right seats? I am, I'll say, a bit surprised at how many times I see organizations looking to find a seat for someone because they're a strong performer in a particular role, but things have changed. Or they may be a weak performer. We really like them as a person, but their particular job has gone away, or the job has changed, or things have evolved, so that now we want to find a new place for a person. From a strategic standpoint, we don't find seats for people. We create seats strategically, so the seat exists, and then you find the right person for the seat. You don't create a seat because you happen to have somebody that you're comfortable with, or happen to have somebody that you like. And I know this can be a challenge. I understand how difficult this can be when you have a highly valued employee, but their existing role is going away for some reason. In many cases, it's not their fault. There's simply the business has changed, the structure has changed, and so the role has gone away. How do we find a place for them? It's probably not strategic thinking to work to find a place for them. Instead, if you've done the work to define your structure properly, and you've done the work to define the roles within that structure and the accountabilities of the roles within that structure, and then you say, okay, we've got this employee. What are that employee's competencies and capabilities? And is there a seat that fits them? And if there isn't, the very best and most respectable and most strategic thing that you can do is to help them move on to elsewhere, because there isn't a seat for them. And if you think about the hiring mistakes that you've made in the past, again, there's a strategic element to this. What I oftentimes see is organizations will hire, of course, we hire everybody with strong expectations, with high expectations. We wouldn't hire somebody if we didn't think they were going to be fantastic in a particular role. So we hire people with high expectations into a particular role, and within some period of time, 6 months, a year, 18 months, for some of them, something doesn't work out. And when we find that someone isn't working out in a role, most of the time, most organizations take way too long to move that person on. They hire too quickly, and they keep people on for much too long, thinking that things are going to change, thinking that they may evolve. And I'm all for giving people a chance. I'm all for helping, mentoring, coaching. My entire career has been in employee development. So I'm all for helping people evolve into roles when there is a mismatch. But in fact, one of the, I wouldn't call it a trend, it's been one of the constants over the last 30 years, is continuously seeing people, leaders, not willing to recognize, hey, we made a bad hire, we made a bad call. Doesn't make them a bad person. They're just not the right fit for this particular seat. They don't make those calls soon enough. And then after they do, after they go through the trauma, the pain, the uncomfortableness of moving someone out or recognizing this person is not a fit, what I see missing strategically is a true, in the military, we use the term after action review, a true after action review to say, okay, how did this happen? How did we, if we have a well-defined structure and we have clearly defined capabilities, and within those clearly defined accountabilities, and within those clearly defined accountabilities, we understand the competencies necessary. If we understand that job, if we understand that role, and somehow we hired someone who wasn't a fit for that role, let's dive deep into why that did not work out. What were the root causes? What are the root causes? We oftentimes, we might have, an employee exit interview, but when you've let an employee go, that number one rarely happens, and even if it does, employees aren't, they may have their list of things they want to complain about, but obviously we're not going to get good data simply from that. So without a deep dive debrief, how do we learn from that? How do we learn from that experience? So again, I'm going to say, from a strategic leadership standpoint, every employee who doesn't work out is an opportunity to think strategically and to learn, how did that happen? Why did that happen? How do we ensure that we don't continue those errors? And if you as an organization are in a situation where you've had and I'll just use a random example, if you've had a stream of sales hires who haven't worked out, or if you've had a stream of customer service hires who haven't worked out, if you've had a stream of these, that should be a huge red flag for you. Even a single hire not working out should be a bit of a red flag. But if you have a series of them, that's a huge red flag. And so again, if you're thinking strategically about your business is your people. And so I can't imagine that you wouldn't consider this to be a critically important thing to dive deep into. And you have to recognize, when we are hiring people, no matter how good you are as a leader, no matter how experienced you are, no matter how clear you have in terms of a competency mindset, we all have blind spots that are driven by our unconscious biases. And when I use the term unconscious bias, I'm not talking merely in terms of racial bias or other traditional diversity factors. I'm talking about the range of unconscious biases that do tend to drive many of our decisions. The affinity bias. We tend to like people who are like us. We tend to like people who talk the way we do, who think the way we do. We tend to like people who just seem like they're going to be interesting to work with, fun to work with. We like people who laugh at what we laugh at. There is a bias called the blind spot bias, which is the belief that you don't have blind spots. So it's a perverse bias of, if you've had a series of really strong hires and you've done well and you've been successful, you can develop what's called the overconfidence bias, where you start to believe in your own ability to make strong hires, and then you stop applying your critical thinking to some of your hires because your instinct says this is a good one. So you hire because of your overconfidence bias based on your instinct. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time right now focused on these biases. Just recognize that even the strongest leaders, even the most competent leaders, we all have a ton of unconscious biases at work, which makes it that much more important that we have clearly defined roles for positions that we hire for, that we have clearly defined competencies for those positions, and that we involve multiple people in the interviews so that we try to blend perspectives. So we're not, it won't eliminate, but it'll minimize the tendency to drive bad hiring decisions because of bias, blind spots. So with that in mind, that's pretty much everything I wanted to share regarding people decisions, but it's worthy of a lot of strategic thought when it comes to strategic leadership, because your people are your business. So with that, now the next element of strategic leadership is probably the classic area that most people think of when they think in terms of leadership strategy, and that is actually developing the strategy for your business, developing and evolving the strategy for your business. But I'll tell you, even in this area, there's a fair amount of confusion when a leader talks about strategic planning. Oftentimes, when you start to tease apart what they're really doing, they're confusing executional planning with strategy development. And these are two very distinct thought processes. And so what I tend to recommend is that you break these two things up. You spend time, whether it's with your senior leadership team or whatever group of people are reviewing the current business strategy and looking to evolve that strategy, based on current market conditions. If every year you have a strategic planning series of sessions with your team, however you are doing your strategic planning, my suggestion would be that you focus a couple of those sessions purely on strategy creation, and you call them that. You do a strategy review and strategy refinement, and you set planning aside at first, because if you start to mix the two, it's very easy for a fantastic executional plan to start to feel like a strategy. And yet the execution plan is not the strategy. What is strategy? Well, strategy is about deciding what are the things that we want to do in the market, what are the right things to do, what's the right way to do those things, how are we going to win in the marketplace, what is our strategy for winning in the marketplace. Planning is about doing those right things. How are we going to execute in order to get those things done? And they are two very different things. The purpose of strategy, again, not planning, not execution, the purpose of strategy is to recognize that every business has limited resources. Every business has competitors. So how are we going to respond to our resource limitations? How are we going to respond to our competitive pressures? What choices are we going to make? We do have to make choices. We have to decide. There are things that we're going to do and there are things that we are not going to do. Where are we going to focus our energies? Where will we compete? What's our aim? How will we win? Some people will call it their value proposition, their winning proposition, their winning value proposition. How do we create value? How are we going to continue to create value? How will our value creation evolve as the market is evolving? How do we create competitive value? How do we create superior profits? How do we create greater value for our customers? This is the purpose of strategy. And most organizations, in my experience, don't spend enough time deeply embedded in these questions. They move very quickly to what are our sales targets? What did we do last year? What do we need to do next year? What are our sales targets? And how are we going to achieve those sales targets? And they create a sales plan to achieve sales targets, and they call that their strategy. Sales targets are not a strategy. Sales targets are an objective. Sales targets are an important thing. You have to have those. But sales targets, growth targets are not a strategy. Those are simply objectives or goals. So when you think of strategic leadership, I think it's important that a strategic leader keeps her organization or his organization focused on constantly checking in to ensure, is our strategy the right strategy in the moment? And as our world changes, we've had in the last few years a lot of very dramatic changes in the marketplace, in the business environment. And that means, in all likelihood, our strategy has to evolve and shift based upon those changes. So while there was a time when annual strategy planning was the typical cadence for most organizations. For some organizations, it may be that quarterly is what's needed now, where we should do a quarterly check-in. Let's do a quick review of our strategy. Does our strategy still make sense? Does our strategy need to evolve or refine? Or it might be semi-annually, or maybe annually still works for your organization. But I do think that in volatile, uncertain times, the strategy cadence probably needs to be more quick than it has been during steady times. So again, the right questions to ask. Where will we compete? What do we want to achieve? How will we win? What will be our key priorities? You've got to make decisions. You've got to make choices, because we can't do everything. We can't boil the ocean. And these are the questions that ultimately deserve deep time, deep thinking, and deep answers before you then decide, okay, so we've got our answers now. How are we going to make those things happen? So generally, strategic leadership in this type of strategic thinking process starts with a situational analysis, where you do a lot of research with your customers, all of your stakeholders, your competitors, your industry dynamics, the broader environment. You probably already get this. I mean, this is probably what you were expecting when you even decided to listen to a program called Strategic Leadership, because this is what most people think of when they hear the term strategic leadership. So as you are pulling together all of the information, and I would recommend that you try as hard as you can to find unique, unusual sources of information that might not be obvious to your competitors. If essentially you're taking the same data set that your competitors are taking, and you're trying to create a unique, compelling, competitive strategy from the same data set, it's possible. It's possible that you can be smarter, wiser, more insightful with the same information. It's more likely that you can be more insightful if you have better information. So it may be that you have other resources, better resources, more expansive resources. Try to find as much data as you can within your situational analysis, so that you can ultimately develop insights about your business, particularly where you will compete and where you will win, or how you will win, as a way of developing your strategy. And then you synthesize all of those insights. And this is probably the most challenging and unique element of strong strategic leaders. I don't know how to train this. I don't know how to teach or coach this. I do know it when I see it. When you see a strategic leader who has the ability to take in large amounts of information and synthesize that information into insights about their business, about their market, and then make strategic choices and create a vision based upon that synthesis of information. And what's interesting is leaders who have this capability tend to attract other leaders who have this capability. So I at least have tended to see strong leadership teams who have the ability to analyze and then synthesize, and then teams who lack that capability. So it seems to be that when you have a strong strategic leader with those capabilities, he or she knows that that's also what they're looking for in the people that they align with and the people that they bring into their organizations. So don't really have a solution, but I do think it's a critical part of strategic analytical capability and synthesis within the organization, making sure you have people who can take large volumes of complex information and develop insight from those volumes. So let's assume for a moment that you have developed a strategy regarding where we will compete, how we will win in the marketplace. Then planning and execution is an important part of the overall strategy cycle. You do have to determine, all right, how are we going to allocate resources? How are we going to allocate projects? Where might we have gaps? Because oftentimes, in fact, most of the time, if you do a good job of developing a forward-looking strategy, and then you now take a look at your entire organization, you oftentimes will develop gaps or identify that we do have gaps. It may be that there are gaps in people, gaps in culture, gaps in structure, gaps in process, or measures or incentives for the organization. You have to, again, be a systems thinker, think about your end-to-end system and identify, okay, how do we align the full organization with this strategy? And that's in complete alignment. One of the, I'll call it errors that I see in planning strategy is just focusing on marketing and sales, or just focusing on some elements of a particular organization to align them with the strategy. Just because your growth strategy primarily is the responsibility of your marketing and sales organization, really, you want to ensure that the entire organization is aligned around whatever your strategy might be and whatever your execution might be. So again, is your org structure aligned with it? Are your processes internally aligned with it? Is your culture, are your performance measures aligned with what your strategy is? Are your incentives, not just with sales and marketing, but broadly within the organization, are your incentives aligned with what your strategy is? That's, again, that is strategic leadership, asking those questions. And generally, when you ask those questions, there's almost always a gap or multiple gaps that you identify. You may not, so whatever those gaps might be, it's important that you are open about them, that you recognize them. And then when you do identify gaps, we'll talk in a moment about, okay, so what do you do with those gaps? But in my mind, there are basically 4 golden rules of good execution of a strategy. Rule number one is translate every key priority into gaps with accountable champions for those gaps. So if you identify that your internal accounting process isn't aligned fully with your strategy, assign an accountable champion to that gap. And a champion is an individual. There can be a team that's contributing, but there needs to be one accountable champion of that gap who will own that gap and will pursue that gap and will measure progress in closing that gap with a relentless determination. But you translate every key priority into your gaps. You assign champions for those gaps, accountability champions. Align all the, so item number 2 is aligning all the levers of the business behind the strategy, not just sales and marketing, but all levers of the business. Item number 3 is to develop a proactive plan to overcome resistance, to know in advance that there is going to be organizational resistance. It's part of human nature, it's part of organizational nature, it's part of cultural nature. If your strategy involves any kind of change, there is going to be resistance. So embrace that, accept it, and develop a proactive plan to overcome that resistance. And it may simply be the proactive plan is a communication plan, not a communication event, but a series of communications. But you want to overcome resistance. You want to quell any uncertainties that employees might naturally have. You want to drive momentum, and you do that through a planning process, a communication process. You don't just wait for, or number one, you don't assume that all the soldiers are going to line up and march forward the way you want them to. You assume there are going to be inconsistencies. You assume there are going to be some folks who don't buy in, and you plan for that proactively. And then finally, item number 4 is to create a simple leadership message about the change, about the strategy, a message that's designed not simply to say, hey, here's the new target, now march. The message should win the hearts and minds of employees. There should be something compelling underneath that message, and then that message should be repeated constantly and continuously. So there should be something in your vision of the strategy that does compel employees to want to come along this journey with you, and does, as I said, capture their hearts and minds. So those are the 4 golden rules. And just to go back to rule number 4, that message that you develop, it's not enough to deliver at once. It has to be part of a communication cadence that is going on and on and on, and is repeated probably until you, as the person delivering the message, or the leadership team delivering the message, long after you think you're over talking it, you should continue talking it, because it does take a while for it to get itself deeply embedded into the hearts and minds of an organization. So when it comes to, again, execution plans, and you've identified these gaps, as I said, designate a gap champion, one individual to own it, along with a team. So you have a team of people for the bigger gaps, but there's got to be someone that you can go to every quarter or at whatever the regular cadence is and say, let's have a check-in on where we are in the process of closing those gaps. And in fact, I would make it gap reporting a part of your quarterly review process or whatever your natural cadence is. In fact, the gap reporting should be first. If you've identified, okay, here's our strategy, we've got these 5 gaps, we've got champions for each of these gaps. If once a quarter, we're going to do a quick review of where we are in terms of our strategy and the execution of our strategy, let's start with our gap champions and have each of them do a report out on the progress we're making in closing whatever those gaps are. Nothing is more important than achieving the desired future state on each of those strategic priorities that have gaps. So you make those your priority by leading with those, not making those the afterthought after you've done all of your other financial reporting or whatever is typical of your quarterly reporting. So that's, I know, a lot when it comes to planning, but when we're looking at planning from a strategic standpoint, that is strategic business planning, not just tactical executional business planning. And we're planning to have an adaptive culture. We're planning to change. We're planning to evolve. And so part of adapting to change and accelerating change, that's also part of strategic leadership. Not simply driving change by diktat or by order, but understanding that in order to accelerate change, you have to recognize what is holding change back in the organization. And change is oftentimes when individuals within organizations are resisting change, it's not because they're resisting change, it's because they either haven't been sold on the potential impact of the change or they have concerns about the impact of the change. And I like to use as a way of, I guess, coaching organizations through change management. I like to use something called the sigmoid curve. The sigmoid curve is sort of the classic business curve where you oftentimes have organizations, and in fact, probably maybe not 100%, but 90% of organizations have gone through a sigmoid curve process over a long period of time, where during the early years when they were initially forming, storming, and norming their business, initially you go through your set of business challenges that ultimately you find solutions for until you finalize your successful business model. Many startups go through a huge chaotic period where they have a conceptual business model, and then they have 1 or 2 or 3 years of startup mode where they are evolving their business model because some things are working, some things are not working. Those initial phases are very uncomfortable for a lot of employees. It takes a certain kind of mindset, a certain kind of person to feel comfortable working through the chaos of those early years as your business model evolves. But then at a certain point, if you're going to be a successful business, you lock in, you identify, okay, this is the thing that's working. And then you may spend years, decades even, with this locked-in business model that's producing very predictable results. And it's a beautiful time, it's a fun time where you are growing and growing and growing and growing, and life is beautiful. But then at a certain point for many businesses, that model stops producing the optimal result that it was producing before. And that model starts to produce less than optimal results. And you start to see in that sigmoid curve, if not a downturn, the beginnings of a flat line. And then if the model doesn't evolve, that flat line can actually start to become a downward turn in terms of the sigmoid curve. Well, if all businesses go through this evolution of initial chaos and challenge, years of linear improvement, linear success, but then at some point that linear success, where every year we can count on 8% growth, 28% growth, 50% growth, whatever we can count on, where suddenly we can't count on that anymore. Well, what do you do? So what learnings do you take away from that? Well, the change management learning that we take from that is that when it comes to the sigmoid curve, the best time to begin preparing for change is before you start to feel the flat line, before things start to settle down. So at the point in time where everything seems to be working just fine, our business model works. Let's just execute the plan. That's a fantastic place to be. It's also the best time to start thinking about the next phase of the plan, the next evolution. The challenge is when everything is going great, what's the purpose of changing? And we're not saying simply change for the sake of changing, but crafting the strategy is the beginning point, and then implementing and executing the strategy gets you to that success, that linear success. However, I'm going to back up my slide here. However, the challenge is when you are in the middle of the sigmoid curve before you've started to see the flat line, it's the time when you have the most resources, the most options available to you. It's the best time to start implementing experiments, to start trying different things, to start learning from your experiments. But most organizations do not proactively experiment when everything is going fine. They start experimenting when they start to flatline. And unfortunately, when you start to flatline, you have constraints regarding financials, you have constraints regarding resources. It's really not the optimal time to start doing strategic experiments. So the reason I share that with you is, again, as we back up and we think about strategic leadership and managing change as a strategic leader understands that some change is counterintuitive. In fact, the most insightful change tends to be the change that's driven when the need isn't obvious. When we don't wait until the sigmoid curve starts to flatten. In fact, in the midst of huge hyper success, that's when we start to think about, all right, what's the next phase? What's going to be next? How do we build from strength to strength to strength, as opposed to waiting until we flatline? So with that, a couple last points to make about the sigmoid curve. The highest probability of successful change exists while you are still successful, as I said, in the middle of the curve. But that's exactly when the support for change is at its lowest. And all of the symptoms of what some people call the curse of success, they represent a formidable set of obstacles to change. When the model is clearly working, the organization is going to say, why are you experimenting? Why are you trying this new product? Why are you trying these new things? Life is good, but that is exactly when you want to do it. If you wait until you begin to fail, yes, you'll have more support for your change. However, the chances of success are going to be lower because you have fewer resources and fewer options. And there's also a lot of pressure to do something that's going to produce a result. So again, I view that as a counterintuitive strategic thinking approach to change management. And I see that in the most successful strategic leaders that I've worked with, where they understand that change management isn't just about responding to a crisis. Change management is about being proactive and driving change, even when the rest of the organization doesn't yet see the need for the change. If you really want to, if you're at a point where you're driving change in an organization, you've got to know that communication is a huge part of driving that change and making sure that employees understand the why behind the change, the what, the specifics, how it's going to be done, how much it's going to impact each of them individually, how much it's going to impact the organization, and what the specific tangible results are that it's going to be produced. And that, what some people would call a burning bridge communication, where you make it very clear that the old way is no longer an option, because the old way is not going to produce the future that we're looking to produce for the organization. developing a message, developing a communication around that old way no longer being a viable option and what the new way is, that messaging is a critical part of driving change and recognizing that the message can't just be delivered once. It's got to be delivered as part of a communication campaign again and again and again in order to truly embed it into the new culture of the organization. So I know I've said a lot, and I'm feeling compelled to kind of summarize some of what we've said in terms of change management. We talked about mobilizing gap teams, very important. Developing a plan to overcome resistance to change and drive momentum. Ensuring that all of the levers of your business ecosystem are aligned to support your new strategy, and crafting a simple but compelling leadership message and repeating that again and again and again. I realize this is, when people think classically strategic leadership, this is what they think strategic leadership is about, and it is about this, but it's also about the broader perspective of the other things that we've been talking about as well. So two final topics that I'll try to get through relatively quickly, but I think they are an important aspect of strategic leadership. And the first is recognizing when things aren't working out. And when you recognize that something isn't working out the way you have planned, recognizing it early and then iterating and course correcting, and essentially applying the exact same strategy process that we've just talked about. So when something doesn't work out, when we're not meeting our sales goals, is just one common example, but there are lots of other examples where something that we planned for isn't working out the way that we had planned it to occur. For all of our strategy, for all of our executional planning, something isn't happening the way we planned for it to happen. What I've seen as the most successful approach is to recognize early that things aren't working out and begin to iterate and course correct based upon that early recognition. So if you're at the end of the first quarter of the year and one of your projects is late, or one of your projects is producing suboptimal results, or you're not meeting your sales plan, or you're not meeting your marketing metrics or targets, whatever the misses might be, recognizing that and course correcting, meaning you don't simply dive in and work harder, you do back up and say, let's take another look at our strategy and our executional plan. Obviously something was amiss because we're not planning to miss, but we are missing. So something in the process is not working, and we have to do a quick review and iterate whatever that process is. But you don't need a new strategic process. You just apply the exact same thinking, the exact same questions, the exact same approach to iterate and course correct and course correct and course correct and course correct early, not late. One common theme I see with organizations is they miss certain metrics in the first quarter, and then they just shift those into the second quarter. And then they miss in the second quarter, and they shift those into the third. And by the time they get somewhere between the third and the fourth quarter, they start to recognize, oh man, this is going to be a miss for the year. And then they get serious about their iteration and course correction. But in fact, the best time to get serious, just like with the sigmoid curve, the best time to solve problems is when the problems are small. The best time to course correct is when the course correction is small, as opposed to letting things build up and build up and build up until now you've got a huge challenge. And generally speaking, it becomes impossible to actually fix. If you can embed into your culture a culture of experimentation where you are continuously trying things, recognizing that not everything is going to work out, not everything is going to produce perfect or intended results. But having a culture of experimentation where you have your plan, and your plan is designed to win, and your plan is designed to hit its mark and hit its targets, but within that plan you also have strategic experiments that may or may not produce results. But you don't build dependency of results on the experiments into your plan. In fact, you might actually plan for 2 out of 3 of your experiments to not produce results at all, or produce suboptimal results or very minimal results. But those constant, continuous experiments within your plan, again, that's part of strategic leadership, knowing that it's not simply creating an executional plan that's going to work out, but within that plan also having strategic experimentation. So, and that experimentation shouldn't be viewed as something apart or separate. It's a part of your executional planning. It's a part of your implementation planning, and it's part of what drives what some of us call strategic learning, where you are learning through these stretches. You're learning through these experiments that aren't guaranteed to win, but that's where some of your best learning and your most insightful learning sometimes can occur. So being willing to be being willing to stretch, to being willing to be strategic in some of your experimentation. Again, that's part of what I view as strategic leadership. And then finally, just to wrap up the full end-to-end thought process regarding a strategic approach to leadership, is sometimes crises occur. When I think of the word crisis, a crisis is, of course, unexpected. It's sudden. It's something you couldn't plan for. If you're missing targets that you could have planned for, that's not a crisis. That's a miss, and you iterate and course correct for a miss. But a crisis is when suddenly there's a natural disaster, or when suddenly there's a dramatic market shift, or when suddenly the pandemic occurs, or that's a crisis. And so when a crisis occurs, a crisis response really is ideally just a very fast-paced version of the strategic planning process that we just talked through, where you go through your same situational analysis. So if you go back to exactly what we were talking about earlier, so a crisis occurs. You begin with a thorough situation analysis. You ask all the questions that we were talking about before, and how this crisis is impacting all of the stakeholders. How is it impacting your competitors? How is it impacting your customers? And you generate insights from that situational analysis. From that situational analysis, you synthesize your unique insights in order to create a strategy for the crisis. And still, crisis strategy is different than implementation of the strategy. So you create your strategy in response to the crisis, and then you build out an implementation plan, an execution plan, and exact same thing. You identify gaps, assign gap champions, and put those champions and their teams to work addressing those gaps. The only difference is speed. A crisis response, whereas a strategic planning process and execution process, that can oftentimes take many weeks or months. Here we're talking probably days or weeks to fully complete this cycle. And of course, the intensity around a crisis response is oftentimes much greater than the intensity surrounding strategic planning. So there, for those of you who have stayed with this the full time, very much appreciate this. And in fact, I'm looking at the attendance numbers, and I appreciate you staying with me, even though I've gone about 10 minutes over time. So that is end to end, our point of view, my point of view, related to what do we mean when we use the term strategic leadership. It's a lot. It can feel overwhelming at first. And sometimes I do have leaders, as I said, who will say, man, how do you expect any one human being to keep all of that in her head or his head at any one time? And truly, none of us can keep all of that in our heads at any one time. But in the end, that is the job of a strategic leader. It's a big job, requires a big mind, and I'm sure all of you are up to it or up to growing into it. So with that, thank you for attending this. Appreciate your attention, and we'll see you potentially in a future webinar.